Last Monday marked the 30th anniversary of the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Next, we take you to the campus of Southern Methodist University for a conference on what journalists remember of that fateful day. Panels include journalists who were in Dallas on November 22, 1963, as they discuss efforts by radio, television, and newspapers to stay on top of the story.
Welcome to Reporters Remember 11/22/63. On behalf of Southern Methodist University, I extend to you a very cordial greeting and a sincere thanks. Thanks especially to all you journalists who covered the assassination 30 years ago and who agreed to return for this event at your own expense. It's great to be together again, there's no question about that. And thanks also to all of you interested citizens who have come to hear us relive our memories. Individuals who have come, I might add, from as far away as Finland. Thanks also to the news media who are here reporting on our proceedings today and relaying them to a far greater audience. I'm Darwin Payne, head of the Journalism Sequence, Center for Communication Arts, Southern Methodist University. 30 years ago, this promises to be a very exciting day, and there can be little doubt about it, an important day. Our recollections are being permanently recorded for future historians, students, and other interested persons by my colleagues in SMU's television radio program. The entire videotape record will be maintained here as primary source material for those who in the future may study that weekend and the media involvement. We intend also to create a 1-hour summary tape and to make it available for wider dissemination. Gathered in this room are some 60 journalists, reporters, editors, photographers, and TV cameramen who were here in Dallas that fateful weekend covering the visit of President John F. Kennedy. We will hear from them vivid recollections of the fast-moving events of that weekend. A dozen or so who are here actually heard the shots at Dealey Plaza. Two of you journalists were in the Texas Theater when Lee Harvey Oswald was captured. Several were in the police basement when Jack Ruby shot Oswald. Some who are here even served as pallbearers for Oswald. There was no one else there to perform that task. You can take a look at us and see that we represented 30 years ago a different era in journalism and American society. We were the last of a particular generation, a generation that now seems greatly outdated. We were almost all men, white men at that. The few women in the business were inevitably assigned to the women's pages. And there were practically no minorities in any of the media. Far more than usual, I would say, the news media was prepared to cover every aspect of President Kennedy's visit. The reason for this was that, frankly, we feared trouble. Only a month earlier, UN Ambassador Adlai Stevenson had been banged over the head with a demonstrator's sign and spat upon as he was surrounded by an angry mob of right-wing demonstrators. In light of this, some had urged that the president cancel his trip to Dallas for fears of his safety. Arriving in Dallas with President Kennedy were nearly 60 reporters and photographers who were a regular part of the president's press corps. They had been joined on the Texas tour by a handful of Texas journalists. All or practically all of these newsmen were riding in the two press buses and a photographer's convertible in the motorcade. In Dallas, awaiting the president and stationed at various points were local reporters and editors and photographers and cameramen. They were from the Dallas Morning News, the Dallas Times-Herald, the local TV stations, and a handful of radio stations that aggressively covered the news. Soon arriving after the shots were fired were journalists from the Fort Worth Star-Telegram and the Fort Worth Press. Scores of other journalists flew here from across the country that Friday afternoon and also from throughout the world. It has been estimated that as many as 300 persons were here on that weekend on the various news teams. The manner in which we journalists covered the most momentous single event of the century already has been widely discussed and scrutinized. Some have praised the press for rapidly disseminating to an anxious, traumatized nation the news of the assassination and the immediate developments afterwards. Television viewing reached the highest level in its history. Many have said TV news came of age during those 4 days. Some have criticized the press for its performance. Some have even tied it into a conspiracy. Here today, we have gathered in one place the largest number ever of journalists who covered the assassination. What follows is not an assessment of our performance, although there likely will be some of that. What we are about to do primarily will be to describe the events that we saw unfold before our eyes and to describe how we covered the story. While it surely is true that no single journalist had a clear, definitive view of the swirl of events occurring that weekend, it is equally true that in a group such as this, certainly a clearer picture may emerge. And that's the spirit of our meeting today, an opportunity to hear one another and to compare notes and perhaps even to correct or adjust our memories. Now on to some basic information. As you will see on your program, we've organized a number of panels to kick off our discussions of the various events and sites of that weekend 30 years ago. After our panelists, we will go to our participating journalists, many of whom will have vivid memories of their own on the subject or who may have pertinent questions. A microphone has been placed on the floor just for you. Members of the audience are encouraged to write down their questions and to give them to our student monitors, who will give the questions to the moderators. We're also going to conduct a poll today. You will have been handed a half sheet of paper with a few questions that will ask you your opinions about the assassination. There's one poll for our audience and another for our journalists. We'll tabulate these and announce the results at the end of the day. Looking ahead to lunch, you have several options. Downstairs on the ground floor is our student cafeteria. You may want to eat there for $5.95. Or you may choose to go to a restaurant called the Main Course in the ground floor of the Hughes Trigg Student Center. Of course, there are also eating establishments along Hillcrest Avenue. Our participating journalists will go through the cafeteria line from the west end of the cafeteria and proceed to the university rooms 1 and 2. Spouses and special guests are invited there. Then at 1:15 p.m. we'll reconvene here. Now we have a busy, intriguing day before us. Let's get started.
And here comes Air Force Number 1, and the President and Mrs. Kennedy have arrived at Dallas Love Field. And there is Mrs. Kennedy, the First Lady, stepping from the plane. She's wearing a bright pink suit with a dark fur collar and a matching pink hat. And the President, wearing a dark suit, steps off directly behind. They are being greeted by placards of varying emotion, those saying we're with you all the way, JFK, and those saying help JFK stamp out democracy. So he is seeing Dallas County politics at the height of a very boiling moment.
I came to see the President, and I said to the President, God bless you, and I meant it.
And here comes the President now. In fact, he's not in his limousine. He's reaching across the fence, shaking hands with many of the people who have come here to see him. But this is one of those impromptu moments for which President Kennedy is so well known. So many times you have heard that the Secret Service men suddenly find themselves without the President. The President and Mrs. Kennedy seated on the back seat, Governor and Mrs. Connolly on the jump seats, and the trip to downtown Dallas and the Trade Mart is underway.
And here comes Jackie waving by. Mrs. Kennedy radiant in that pink outfit. We can see the crowd is absolutely going wild. They're driving at about 5 miles an hour. Plenty slow enough for the people on hand here to get a good look at them, to get a good wave in, and I'm sure that everybody in my immediate vicinity would swear that they were waving directly at them.
And any fears that might have existed in the minds of some about the alleged small handful of people who might have launched severe demonstrations to mar the President's visit were apparently unjustified. As the motorcade moved through, that there was no danger whatsoever. A completely overwhelming welcome for the President.
Now, some of the most important decisions, or perhaps the most important decisions, were made behind the scenes in the newsrooms. Decisions such as when to release information, how late to hold up deadlines, where to send photographers, reporters, and many other things. The moderator for this panel, Eddie Barker, who was the news director for both TV and radio, as well as the on-the-air anchor for KRLD Channel 4 in Dallas, a multiple role that today is unheard of in such a large market. As Eddie himself puts it, little is known about his early years, although he admits to being born in San Antonio. He made it through high school, got himself hired as the youngest announcer ever on the old humble Southwest Conference football circuit, and when Channel 4 went on the air in Dallas on December 3rd, 1949, he was there. He stayed there until 1972 when he left the news business. Eddie broke some sensational stories over the years, among them the Franklin Spears story in which the doctor blew up an airplane after having a friend take his seat on it. He also had the first television interview with Marina Oswald. Eddie's was almost assuredly the most familiar face in Dallas as he delivered the news every night on KRLD TV. That familiarity, perhaps, is what led a Parkland doctor to confide to Eddie early on that Friday afternoon that the president was dead. Eddie, feeling confident of his source's knowledge, announced the president's death over KRLD and CBS without official confirmation. He stuck to his guns despite network fears that it was premature. Journalism Quarterly, the scholarly publication for the profession, called his decision one of the greatest snap evaluations of a source in the history of broadcast journalism. At this year's RTNDA meeting, the members named a special award for Eddie to commemorate forever his achievement. These days, Eddie is involved in the meeting, planning, and convention business through his public relations firm, Eddie Barker and Associates. He's married, has 5 children, including a daughter who's a reporter and a son who is a Secret Service agent, and he has 9 grandchildren. Eddie Barker.
Thank you very much, Darwin. And as you said, we call our first panel here Instant Decisions, Directing the Coverage. And very frankly, I can't think of a time in history when it was more important to make a decision very quickly and then hope to God that you were right. And this panel that we have with us this morning are the folks that had to make some of those decisions. And I think that history is pretty well recorded that the decisions they made at the time were decisions that they can still live with 30 years later. I was in the decision-making business then, too. One of the things that I think that we really have to think about as we reminisce of what happened back then was the tools that we had to work with 30 years ago compared to the tools that we have to work with today. In television, of course, we had black and white film. We had old DH and DL cameras that we hoped we had the good sense to pull the filter out of when we went inside to take inside footage. We knew how to run an Oricon camera. We knew how to make a tape recording. Hopefully, we knew how to edit film, how to write to film, and how to go on the air. With this visit of the president coming to Dallas, my newsroom, as all newsrooms, decided that we really had to do this one first class. And the reason, not only because it was the visit of a president, because as Darwin mentioned a minute ago, there were so many things going on in Dallas and in the Texas Democratic Party that it was going to be a fun day for sure. One of the things that you may not remember is the fact that the Democratic Party was pretty much split down the middle in those days. And then Senator Ralph Yarborough refused to ride in the same car with Vice President Lyndon Johnson in that parade. That was the bitterness of this thing. And it was the reason that the president came to Dallas in the first place, was to try and heal some of these wounds, not only here in Dallas, but all over the state. So we turned out our entire newsroom that day for television, for radio, and for 4 hours of talk radio. We had a total of 31 people. And by today's standards, I don't think that was very many. We covered the event. Certainly, those were a couple of our guys on the tape that you heard there. I recognize Bob Huffaker is with us today, and Wes Wise. Film was shot, a lot of it by George Phoenix, who's also here with us today, and you'll be hearing from all of them later. As far as another reason for our trying to plan excellent coverage was the fact that the Adlai Stevenson incident that Darwin referred to. Wes Wise, who then was our sportscaster as well as a newscaster as well as a cameraman and everything else, and later mayor of Dallas. I won't tell you how he got to be mayor of Dallas because it's a little embarrassing. But he used to. But we back in those days we started talk radio in this market, and we had a show called Comment, and it ended every afternoon with what we called the Great Garage Sale of the Air. And Wes Wise sold more baby buggies and mattresses, etc., than anybody in memory, and it got him into the mayor's office in Dallas. Those were different times too, because reporters trusted cops, cops trusted reporters. And as this panel goes on, these panels go on today, you're going to wonder if the Dallas Police Department was not the private taxi service of such notables as Hugh Ainsworth and Jim Ewell. Well, so much for my rambling. Let's get to some of these guys who had to make some of those very tough decisions. And one of them, of course, was Tom Simmons, my old and dear friend who's seated here on my right. Tom, of course, was with the Dallas Morning News for his entire career, I think, and that was the time when he had to come into play because the then managing editor was off on jury duty somewhere. And Tom, as I recall, you were also out at the Trade Mart as I was at the time of the shooting, if that's not correct. Tom was one of the stalwarts in this market for many years, and why don't you tell us what happened down at the Dallas News, how you started getting ready for this thing, and what happened when all hell broke loose?
Of course, at the News, this was a great day for our news staff, and it was blemished, of course, by the famous one-page ad put in by Mr. Weissman, welcoming Mr. Kennedy to Dallas in the most scurrilous terms you could imagine. And when we saw that ad in the paper, this kind of sent a shiver up our spine, and we wondered what we could do to play that down. And of course, this was in the morning. And then Gene and I and Jack Kruger's wife went to the Trade Mart where the president was coming to address the luncheon. And we were seated there, and nothing was going on, and one of the service doors opened, and I saw our photographer Bill Winfrey, who is probably here this morning, come in, and he was shaking like an aspen. And I went over and said, what's up, Bill? He said, I heard on the police radio that the president has been shot. And that was the first word into that auditorium of what had happened. I went back to the table and told the ladies what I had heard, and the wife of the Methodist Bishop Martin was seated next to me, and her reaction was so amazing. She sort of sniffed and said, well, you might have known it would be Dallas or something like that. That was the immediate reaction of so many people, including a woman like her whom I had never seen before or since. But about that time, the reporters who were covering the luncheon had come in, and they were seated behind the head table, and all of a sudden, just as on cue, every one of them sprang up and started running out the door, and I said, well, they've got the word to them. Then an announcement was made from the head table of what had happened, and that immediately, of course, let us all go. So I caught a ride with this wild-eyed police reporter, Harry McCormick, and we drove over curbs. Gosh, no thrill ride at Six Flags has ever been worse than that. I told Gene to take the ladies home, and I'd be in touch later. So So we got to the news, and as Eddie mentioned, Jack Kruger was on jury duty in federal court. And he called shortly after I got there, and he said he'd gone out to look at the parade, and he had to go back to the jury room at 2 o'clock, but he'd be down there a few minutes after that, as soon as the judge let them go. Meanwhile, Bill Reeves and I, who were the assistant managing editors, were to see that things were shaping up. Of course, they shaped up automatically. Johnny King, the city editor, Tom Dillard, and the photographers, they knew what they were supposed to be doing without being assigned. So I started making tentative decisions. You know how you do when the boss is out of the office. You do something and you hope that when he comes back in a few minutes it won't be wrong. So Bill and I marshaled our forces as best we could, laying these tentative programs out, and we waited for Kruger, and we waited for Kruger, and we waited for Kruger, so that he could come in and change things around. He came in at 4:30, and he was absolutely petrified. He said, Judge Davidson, this was old Judge T. Whitfield Davidson, who was still conducting trials after he was 90 years old. He assembled us after lunch, and he said, this is a sad day in the history of our nation. Said, but the jurisprudence must go on. Be seated, gentlemen, and continue the testimony. Well, you can imagine the jurors and the plaintiffs, the defendants, the lawyers, cooped up in a federal courtroom with something like that going on. And when Kruger came, we, of course, had things pretty well going ahead. The decision was whether we should have an extra. And, of course, the newsroom, yeah, we'll have an extra. What time? Give us a deadline and we will meet it. And it went back and forth, shall we not? The circulation manager was there, ready to get the press crews started, ready to get people to take the extra out. You just don't print an extra and let it lie there in the building. This is an enormous project. And then finally, the heads of the 4th floor, which was where all the executive offices were, they took a look at that ad, and they took a look at what happened. And they said it would just really not be good for the news to be coming out with seeming to profit by the president's death. So let's just forget about the extra. Go ahead, we'll move the deadlines up early as best we can and go on from there. And one of the brilliant moves that we made, and I don't know whether it was Jack or Bill or me, was to tell Paul Kroom that he was to write the lead story. You younger people may not know that Paul Kroom was the front page columnist of the news for 20 years and the sage philosopher of Lariat, Texas. He was the one most prominent personality that the Dallas News had. And Kroom sat there, chain-smoking cigarettes, sweating over his typewriter. No computer in those days, just a plain typewriter. And he threaded together a beautiful story, and of course, right in the middle of it, things would happen. He gets started, Oswald is shot. Then Tippit is shot. Then rumors about, was it a conspiracy? This, that, and the other. The LBJ swearing in. You could not have dumped a more complicated story on a writer, and yet he managed it so beautifully that that was one decision that we made early, and we made it right.
Tom, thank you very much for those remarks. We'll get back to you a bit later. And next to Tom is Russ Thornton, and Russ was at Channel 5 WBAP in those days, KXAS TV today, the NBC affiliate, and they had a unique problem because the newsroom was in Fort Worth, and the film that we talked about, we had to shoot and go process and all, was over here in Dallas. So Russ, how did you manage?
Pretty well, as it turned out. Before I get started, I just want to tell Tom that I also bummed a few rides with Harry McCormick, and we're both lucky to be here today. The role that I played was not all that significant, and I wish that Doyle Vinson were alive today and would be able to be with you, because he's the one that made the early decisions, and a couple of our people, Bob Welch and Jimmy Darnell, I think you'll hear from later, had direct contact with him early on. As most everybody can, well, as I look at some of these gray hairs around here, most of us can't remember what happened yesterday.
Folks used to call you Red, remember?
Yeah. It's kind of tough to look back 30 years, but I do remember when I first heard about this, I was brushing my teeth, so I wasn't even at work. But the thing that I remember, I guess, most at the beginning of this thing was the planning that went into the coverage. And NBC's Dallas guy then was a man named Mo Levy. And Mo could just bug you to death, and he bugged us to death probably 2 weeks out on how we're going to do this, you know, making plans. And I really had rather he would have gone away, but he didn't. But basically, he had a legitimate concern because of the problems that had occurred in Dallas earlier, that there was quite likely going to be some kind of demonstration or incident or something that was out of the ordinary for a presidential visit. And so what we wound up doing was pooling our people with the network people. They brought in people, and they also had some freelancers they brought in. And so we had everybody placed everywhere you could think of, except the right place. As it turned out, the amateurs beat us with the pictures at the school book depository. But at any rate, we had Love Field covered. Of course, we had the other problem that the president was, excuse me, in Fort Worth that morning, and we had covered his speech at the Texas Hotel and his departure, and everything seemed to be in good shape, and most of us were out to lunch, and I wasn't even at work yet. My primary job was to produce the 10 o'clock news that night. So at any rate, we thought we had everything covered well, and then it all went to hell fast. When I left the house, I only knew that shots had been fired in the motorcade, and I'm sure it wouldn't happen today, but it took me 10 minutes to get to the station, and there was nothing on the radio about this in that 10 minutes. And time just seemed to drag, you know, give me some more information, and it didn't come. And as I recall, the same thing waiting through the AP and UPI wires. You just sat there and looked, and nothing happened. And I'm sure it didn't take very long. It just seemed like it took forever.
Speaking of that UPI wire, next to you, Russ, is Preston McGraw, who did everything at UPI for forever. And I was noting in his response to come here that he had written this great hold for release story about speech in Dallas. So, Mac, why don't you tell us a little bit about what UPI was up to and about that story and whatever happened to it?
Excuse me, started in Fort Worth on Thursday night. In those days, we always bulletined the president's arrival and departure. And I went to Carswell, and I did that. Went to a telephone in a building on the edge of the runway, and telephoned the arrival in. And as I wanted to go back after I telephoned, but the president's party had pulled up then, and I wanted to go across the apron of the runway and see what was going on. And the lieutenant stopped me, and he said, "You can't go there." And I said, "Why not?" And well, he said, "We're not allowing people to go across the field." And I told him I had to go and what I was up to, and he said, I'd better go with you. And I asked him why. And he said, you might get shot otherwise. Anyway, he took me over there, and I stayed with I watched the goings on until they left for the hotel. And then I went to the hotel, and the next morning I covered the speech at to the Democrats, and at the same time I picked up the advance on the speech he was to give in Dallas. And I wrote an advance on it and hold for release, and sent that by telegraph, and then I went on to Dallas. In the meantime, Merriman Smith, who was with the White House correspondent and who had gone on to Dallas, he was in a car right behind the president and Mrs. Kennedy, and I went on to the trade mart. And there was a flurry of activity, and it made me nervous, so I went to a phone we had in the lobby and called the office and asked what was going on. They said the president has been shot, and I asked where could I do the most good, and they said Parkland Hospital. So I went to the hospital.
Okay. And next to Preston is Buster Haas from the Dallas News, and I apologize, Buster, that we have your name spelled wrong there on the there on the card. Tom Simmons called that to my attention early on. Buster, what kind of detail was going on down there at the News at the time?
Well, actually,
you were kind of in the nitty-gritty down there.
Well, I think I might appear under false pretenses. I was a makeup editor at the News at that time, and that was my job that day. Tom did all the work and told me what to do.
Okay.
However, I think I may have been one of the few editors that actually was at Dealey Plaza when the president was shot. My wife and my son and his 4 Kennedy buttons that he was wearing at the time. We'd gone down there that morning. I'd had about 3 hours sleep before that. But the one thing I remember most was all the type that we had to get in the paper that night. I think the instructions were get everything in the paper that's fit to print, get every picture that is printable in the paper. We'll publish as many pages as it takes. It turned out, I think we started out with 46. Pardon. We started out with 46 pages, and I think we wound up with 50, and which was tremendous at that time, 8 blank pages. But we weren't set up in the composing room. I mean, they did a tremendous job of setting the type, but they didn't have any place to put it. So they were piling it on top of trays of type. And as on that day, I was assigned to be picture editor. We did not have a picture editor at the time, so it was probably the first one in the history of the Dallas News assigned to be a picture editor. But I finished the night on, as a makeup editor with another makeup editor. But the hardest part for us was trying to find the type being stacked up. But we finally succeeded. About 4 o'clock in the morning, we finally left the News.
So how late was the final edition that day?
It was after 2 o'clock. We just went until we could get everything in.
Okay.
It would have been, but we finished about 4 o'clock. I mean, the newsroom finished at 4 o'clock in the morning.
You know, I guess one of the most famous photos is the one of Lyndon Johnson being sworn in aboard Air Force One. And our next panelist sitting down here is Dave Taylor of the AP Photo Division. And Dave played quite a role in that picture being developed. Why don't you tell us about that, Dave?
Cecil Stoughton, who was the Army photographer accompanying the president, brought the film into our office along with some of the photographers that were with the president, and we processed it. Since it was made by the Army, we had to pull it with UPI, so we made the prints, and UPI sent a man over to pick up, and we were there and trying to decide an off time. They had to get back. We wanted to transmit simultaneously. And I had one phone talking to Jerry McNeil to see if he'd gotten the picture yet and ready to go. And the other phone was our New York office screaming, how much longer, how much longer? So finally, Jerry got the picture and got his caption written. Ours was ready to go, and we said, okay, let's have it. And we both went at the same time. Picture moved all over the United States, and then from then on, we retransmitted and retransmitted all over the world, and that kept on. After that, well, it was just pandemonium. Photographers went to the police station, Texas Theater, and everywhere else, and it just constant running around from then on.
Well, now you also got in on the a little later on the Zapruder film. You were one of the first people to take a look at that.
Harry McCormick came in and told us that the Zapruder film was going to be shown Saturday morning, and we went up there, and it was UPI and Time and Life, Associated Press, and maybe some others, and we started the bidding on the film, and I was on the phone to New York. Our general manager told me how much money I couldn't spend, and
Dave, how much did he authorize for the AP to spend for the film?
It was $1,500 when I went back to our man to tell him why. Mr. Zapruder said, well, he said, Time and Life has already bought the film, and later on he said, just what would the AP have paid? I said, Mr. Zapruder, you'll never know.
Thank you, Dave. And Tom Dillard, who for many years herded all of those, or told all those photographers down at the Dallas News what was in focus and what was out of focus. And Tom had quite a weekend, both in the very beginning and as that weekend progressed. Tell us a little bit about it, Tom, if you will.
Pardon?
You're on.
Yes, I know I'm on, but I didn't know your question.
Oh. Would you run the tape back? No. I was just saying that you kind of told all those photographers down there at the News what to do and how to do it, and so you had one big weekend of a lot of folks telling them what to do. Tell us a little bit about how that photography department operated that weekend.
Well, I didn't really tell everyone what to do.
Well, I'm kidding you a little bit.
We had a rather peculiar situation. Most of the photo operation requests came through the various editors, especially the city desk. Before this thing developed, the Kennedy arrival, we assigned responsibilities to certain photographers. I personally had the president as my responsibility while he was in Dallas. We had, of course, other people at certain locations. I was to get the arrival at Love Field and the parade and the luncheon. Those were my responsibility. And it is important that the president's pictures were my responsibility. So at Love, everything went fine up to the point that the whole day became great frustration for a photographic person. First thing, parades were usually handled with a flatbed truck for pool and certain selected photographic personnel to ride in front of the presidential car on presidential parades. That was canceled at the last minute. We were put in Chevrolet convertibles to ride several cars back. I think we were about 6 cars, Bob Jackson and I, and a couple of other boys were in this parade. And that put us totally out of the picture. The parade stopped once for Kennedy to go out and shake hands out in North Dallas. And I tried to run up and get a picture there, but by the time I got there, the parade had started again. So I was unable to do anything. And then we arrived up on Houston Street, and the shots broke out. 1 shot, then 2 shots, then 3 shots. I immediately recognized them as rifle shots. Bob Jackson said he saw a rifle in the window on the upper floor. Time I located it and got a wide-angle shot and a telephoto shot, the rifle had already gone. Frustration. I jumped out of the car, ran down to the corner. People were lying on the ground. I shot a picture or two there. Saw there was nothing for me there. Jumped on the next car that came by, went out to the Trade Mart. People there told us that the presidential car had gone by. I went directly to the hospital. There was nothing at the hospital but some people trying to put the bubble back on the limousine. And from then on, it was just problems. Photographically, we couldn't do anything. Bob Jackson and I discussed it last night, what great frustration it was. Bob, unfortunately, had unloaded his camera when the shooting started. And he had no film, no way to shoot. He had, for an early edition. But then, of course, photographically, we had Joe Dealey, our president, at the Dallas News. In his generosity, turned over our morgue, our reference library, to all the visiting press. They were to receive pictures at our $2 a print fee. Of course, what happened, the press scavenged our reference library and took everything of any value and carried it off. I stayed up quite late, and later on that evening we learned about the Zapruder film. Harry McCormick and I went out to the film lab, and I tried to talk Zapruder and let me have a copy, let me photograph a frame of his film. And Harry McCormick tried to con Zapruder into letting him be the representative of his film. Neither of us were successful. Of course, then it was back to the office and trying to make some sense of the whole thing. The next morning, Saturday, I went to Bill Decker's office and sat around there most of the day trying to get a picture of Oswald being shipped down to the county, which is the normal procedure. And the powers that be, Curry and the others up at the police station, held back because of pressure from the national media, I think. So Oswald never appeared at Bill Decker's shop. Someone came to the shop and told a television cameraman, Bill Underwood,
Jim Underwood,
who's dead now, I understand, about a bullet mark on the curb. So Jim and I went down there, and I took my pen out and held it for him to shoot a shot, and then he held the pen for me to take a still shot. And that doesn't seem to have shown up very much, which seems to me to be a rather key facet of the first bullet theory, because there's very definitely a rifle bullet mark on the curb directly in line with the 6th floor of the school book depository, which we have the picture, and later events, the media seems to have come along to my way of thinking that there was one gunman without conspiracy.
Thank you, Tom. And down there next to you is my old friend Charlie Dameron, and Charlie had probably a unique problem in that the Times-Herald, which, as we know, is no longer in existence, was the afternoon paper then, and to have this big event take place at 12:30 when you'd planned everything else, tell us what happened.
Well, I think any of you out there who have ever toiled in the vineyards of an afternoon newspaper, a metropolitan paper, can understand the terrible problem that we faced of covering an event considered very, very big. We had rarely ever had a president come into Dallas, if you think about it. You know, Roosevelt came in way back and dedicated Lee Park, a few things like that. But so this was big doings. Of course, we published 4 editions a day at that time, and we'd hit the streets in the morning about 10:30 with a street sale edition that would go out into the country also. Then about an hour later, we'd follow up with a county edition that there were 28 municipalities in Dallas County in those days, and we distributed a few papers to all of them. Then our first home delivery went to about 100,000 homes, and we decided, of course, as we started planning, there's no way we could put a paper into the homes of people in Dallas that didn't have the President of the United States here and what he was doing. So we had a high-powered gathering of editors and to plan all of this, and we decided, well, we would produce, of course, 2 editions. We couldn't very well stop that, and then we would just hold the presses, which was a most extraordinary thing at the Dallas Times-Herald and probably at the Dallas Morning News, too. You know, production guys blanched at the thought of holding presses up for an hour to put a story. Anyway, we did that. But I'd like to sort of set the stage briefly. As an afternoon paper, you know, back 30 years ago, you mentioned, you know, our tools that we worked with. They were a little rudimentary compared to 1993. You know, reporters still wandered around with scraps of old copy paper that they'd folded up, and they took notes on it, and they seemed to write stories just as well as the later reporters who had nice little notebooks. They came back and banged their stories out on old Remingtons and Underwoods, you know, and they turned them in takes as the deadlines approached on important stories, and all of you know what a take was. You know, write 2 graphs and rip it out and throw a holler copy, and a copy boy would come pick it up. Then the editors would turn these stories or these takes over to the rim men on the old horseshoe desk, which, Buster, you remember quite well. And some of those guys even wore the old black shades there, you know, the old eye shades. And they were pretty good, too. And they used these very black pencils. I think they were number 1s or whatever they were, black enough so that you could scratch out and make a reporter's copy readable and accurate and grammatical and all of those good things. And of course that doesn't happen anymore because we got the computers, which are marvelous, marvelous things. But then down in the composing room, you know, they had all these other old guys with the eye shades who sat there in those clanking machines. We had about 40 of them in the newsroom, in the composing room, and they would set type. And they could set type very well when they had to. So anyway, we were all constrained on an afternoon paper, especially with time. How much can you produce? Linotype machines don't set type very fast, or did not. You had to go through stereotype. You had to go through all that business. It took about 45 minutes for us to produce a zinc engraving to get into the paper. We didn't even have a graving shot, neither did the Dallas News. We farmed it out and had these little guys on bicycles to run up and pick up these pictures and dash down and bring the cuts back for the editions. Anyway, so the rigid schedules were a little frightening at times, and as we decided what we were going to do when the president came to town, we sat down and then drew up, and I finally put this thing together as a news editor, a meticulous operation, almost like a military operation with the rather limited personnel resources we had. The Times-Herald in those days didn't believe in spending large amounts of money on extra reporters and editors. And they didn't believe in paying lots of money to reporters and editors either. But so we decided, in light of what has been discussed before, the Adlai Stevenson event, John Birchism was fairly rampant in some areas of Dallas, in North Texas. We were sort of scared or a little apprehensive, I guess, that some nut was going to do something stupid, you know, like that matronly lady who slammed Stevenson in the face with that placard, you know, and spat at him, you know. That was real. That was real Dallas, wasn't it? And so I drew up this plan to station a photographer and reporter at every major intersection on the route of the motorcade, so that if something happened, we'd have folks close by. We had two top reporters already riding with the president's press plane. Bob Hollingsworth was our Washington correspondent. He had been with the president, of course, all along, and over to Fort Worth and so forth. We had two other reporters and a photographer we sent over to Fort Worth early in the morning on that fateful Friday to pick up sidebar stuff and et cetera, and just to be on hand there. And then they were to dash back over to Dallas by the time the president was dashing over to Dallas to Love Field. And they would stay there. They would stay at Love Field till the president departed later after the speech. So we were trying to be sure we had bodies everywhere we need to be placed. We had 6 reporters and 2 photographers inside the Trade Mart building. Now, I think Tom probably would back me up. When you got in there, you couldn't get out. And that's the reason we put these people inside. Vivian Castleberry, who's probably here today, Vivian was one of the many people, there she is, who was there at the Trade Mart building. Then we had stationed a couple of photographers and a couple of reporters and photographers outside the building so that, you know, they could at least be fluid enough. Now, this was all just at the preparation. Back in the office, we beefed up a rewrite staff. We had a rewrite system in those days that sort of modeled after the great Chicago newspaper rewrites. We put very experienced, fast writers, experienced people who could turn copy out, you know, and by the ton. And we beefed it up to 5 people. We picked out the copy editors or copy readers, as we called them then, who each was assigned specific stories. We gave them the slug line. Now, you know, we were back in the Neanderthal days. We had a little old slip of paper we'd write the slug lines on so we could send it down to the composing room. But we wanted to be sure we didn't have conflicting slug lines or we would wind up with a damnedest mess. So we were all ready to go. And then, of course, you know, all hell broke loose. But during that planning, we had decided that we must have a live picture of the president in the afternoon paper, even though we were holding the press and whatnot. And this was the good days, as you say, when cops and reporters and editors were real friendly, and we conned this guy with a motorcycle cop to bring some film downtown from Love Field so we could make that doggone audition. And here he come roaring up, and we had somebody meet him outside and grabbed the film and souped it out. We also wanted to get some pictures in the later editions. We expected to probably produce a couple of editions that afternoon or 3. And we assigned Jim Featherston, who is out here. Jim was our courthouse reporter, and his main job, among other things, was to be out there as the photographer's press car passed, and to get this film, which was to be shoveled out to him. And I think Jim will probably later tell you about that. It scattered all over the street, and my God, he rolled the film going all over the place. And of course, 3 or 4 minutes later, the assassination took place, and we almost forgot that stuff.
Charlie, we'll be picking from the assassination on as we go on into the day.
Yeah.
And there was one thing that I wanted to get into. There was only one newspaper in the area here that did an extra, and that was the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. I think Horace Craig is here this morning. Or where are you, Horace? Well, come up here and tell us, if you will, why the Star-Telegram decided to go with an extra, and neither of the Dallas papers did. Well, you're going to have to raise that in mic, aren't you? We've got you 8 feet tall.
Well,
that's all right.
I'll just
have at it.
loud.
All right.
Well, thank you, Eddie. I'm Horace Craig of Fort Worth Star-Telegram. And at this time, I was the assistant city editor, which means for $5 extra a week, I'd work all the hours that nobody else wanted to work, and on the days when they didn't want to come in. So that's why I was in the office that Sunday that Oswald was shot. My first job that day was to go by the newsstand and pick up all the out-of-town papers for the executive editor. This done, I was in the office alone with the one copy boy who was cutting a wire copy, and I was trying to figure out what I was going to do with my staff of 2 that was coming in later in the day. When my city editor's wife, Jean Hitch, called, said she had been watching television and just saw Oswald shot at the station. Well, that meant my quiet Sunday was shot also. I immediately went to the wire room and I checked, and the AP was moving a bulletin at that time that this was the case. I went to the phone and notified my editor, Jack Butler, began calling in the staff. We called in everybody on the staff, sent half of them to Dallas, and decided I better keep about half of them in the office because I was going to get flooded with a ton of copy here shortly. But this being Sunday, we didn't have an afternoon paper, and it was a long dry spell before our readers would really get anything in hand. So it was decided early on that we would publish an extra this day. So our editor, Jack Butler, took on the chore of putting together the staff that we'd need. He called in the typesetters and the stereotypers and the pressmen, the copy readers. He worked with circulation to make sure we could get the paper circulated. My memory, I forget how many papers we published, but I think we sold all of them that day.
I bet you did. Thank you, Horace, very much. I appreciate it. Okay. How many? 2,000?
30,000.
30,000. Okay. Great.
Jack Tinsley here.
Oh, is Jack back there?
Yes.
Okay. Gotcha.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Horace. We are...
Eddie, one thing. We published 2 extras that weekend, one on Friday afternoon after the regular run, and then one on Sunday afternoon. And copies of both of them are over there in that display on that side.
Great. Thank you very much, Jack.
Say, Eddie, before you close off, I know all of you have probably seen it, but I did bring some of the real, honest front pages that we managed to come up with late that afternoon.
What time did that hit the streets?
This hit the street about 2 o'clock. And we had to go and get what we used to call the big linoleum type to make a headline because the Ludlow machine wouldn't set anything above 72. So we turned out about 100,000 extra papers that afternoon over the normal run. We had really put out 3 editions when we got through with it.
Okay, thank you. Well, we are going to try and keep this on time, and I think, Darwin, we are just about on time. Did you want to move on? Well, thank you, gentlemen, very much. And we'll move on. We'll have the big switch and move to our next panel.
Yeah, I understand there are problems on hearing, and we're sending for someone to take care of that. And at the break this morning, the sound system's going to be replaced so that you in the audience, at the back of the audience, will be able to hear very well, I hope. And if you can't hear, you're missing some great stuff. We need, and I'm sorry about that. You can buy the video. We need to get Hugh Ainsworth's panel up here now, so let's just stretch in your seats for a second while we change panels, if you will.
All the people on this panel have unique experiences about that day. My first panelist here, Clint Grant, wonderful, wonderful gentleman and one of my good friends. He was at the news for many, many, many years. May still be, for all I know. Are you, Clint? Still there? All right. Clint came all the way with JFK from Washington, was in San Antonio, Houston, and Fort Worth before he came here. I remember one story he told about how his luggage was on Air Force One, and he called after the assassination and asked if he should go back with the body, and they said no, so he had to really skedaddle it out to get his luggage off that plane. But Clint, can you tell us a little bit about all the involvement, all the things that you saw that day?
Well, I've condensed mine so we can read it in the interest of time. Leaving from Washington November the 21st for the President and White House press, we have visited San Antonio, Houston, and arrived in Fort Worth at 2 a.m. November the 22nd. The following morning, we actually flew the short distance from Fort Worth to Love Field. If you can imagine flying from Fort Worth to Love Field. My last shot at the airport showed the President, Vice President, Rick Connolly, their wives, Eric Johnson, the Chief of Police, Secret Service men, and Air Force One in the background. Then I hopped into the open Cadillac convertible with 3 White House photographers. We were the number 2 camera car behind the President. 25 minutes later, as we turned the corner at Main and Houston, I heard 3 shots ring out. As we turned into Elm off Houston at the Houston Book Depository, we saw the President's limo take off at high speed with Secret Service men scrambling to get aboard. Spread out all over the lawn were people protectively sprawling over their children. The driver of our car was a Texas Ranger from Austin. Neither he nor the other photographers were from Dallas or New Dallas. I had to direct them. We went to the Trade Mart. No one there seemed to know anything except that the President was not there. I had been away from Dallas for over a week and thought maybe they had moved to Market Hall. We went across the street there, asked, and the custodian there said that a limo and police escort with sirens blaring had just passed. I said, uh-oh, they're headed for Parkland, turn around. Well, of course, that's a one-way street there. We turned around, we were facing the rest of Entourage. After we finally straightened out that mess, we rushed to Parkland. There in the limousine's back seat was a bouquet of roses. After a long wait, LBJ came off and was whisked off. Figuring he was headed for his plane, I radioed the city desk to ask if I should go to Washington with the President's body. They said no, so I grabbed a cab, rushed to Love Field to retrieve my luggage. Original plans were to go on to LBJ's ranch. Just as I reached the plains, Judge Sarah T. Hughes was coming off the Vice President's plane. I just missed her swearing in the new President.
Thank you, Clint. Is this on? No, it's not. Yes, it is. Sorry. I had 2 questions. 1, did you get your luggage? And 2, did the Dallas News pay your cab fare?
Yes.
Our next speaker is Bo Byers. I didn't know Bo until years later. Bo had a long career with the Associated Press long before he joined the Houston Chronicle, which he retired from probably 10 years ago. That day, Bo was here, and he'd been in Fort Worth also. I believe you were on the White House bus, weren't you?
Right.
Tell us what your remembrances are of that day.
Okay, let me jump back to Fort Worth for just a second because it ties into being in Dallas the next day. Late the night before in Fort Worth at the Texas Hotel, several reporters, John Connolly, Julian Reed, who was his PR man, and I think Mike Myers, who I believe was from Dallas, were eating a late breakfast before going to bed. And Connolly asked me, he said, Bo, he said, don't you have a poll coming out tomorrow on how Goldwater and Kennedy would run in Texas? And I said, yes. I knew that my editor had told him. I said, yes, we do have a poll coming out. And he said, well, what does it show? I said, well, you can read it tomorrow in the paper. We went to the elevator, and as he was getting on the elevator, he turned around and he said, come on. He said, you've got that story with you, haven't you? I said, yeah, I do. He said, give it to me. Well, kind of on impulse, I took it out of my coat pocket and gave it to him. This ties in to a story that Connolly told me later, that Kennedy had asked him how he thought they would do the next year against Goldwater as they were riding in the parade. And Connolly told him, he said, well, the Chronicle has a poll coming out today. And Kennedy said, well, what does it show? He said, well, it shows it would be close, but you could win it. Our poll actually showed that Goldwater would have won at 52 to 48, which is fairly close. Kennedy had won in 60 51-49 against Nixon. With that background, I'm going to jump to Dealey Plaza. I was on the White House press bus. We were on Houston. I was looking across the plaza when we heard the shots. I remember 3 shots. And I've always had a memory, matter of fact, I've had nightmares about it, of the sunlight on Kennedy and the explosion, the car almost coming to a stop, almost to a dead stop, and then accelerating at tremendous speed. So I knew, his instinct, I knew that he had been shot, at least shot at. We went to the Trade Mart because we didn't know definitely what had happened. We went to the Trade Mart and went storming in there, found out that he was at Parkland. I asked Bob Manning, he said, yes, he's at Parkland. I said, is he dead? He said, I don't know, but he was hit. I called my news desk and gave them that bit of information, gave them a first-hand story on my eyewitness account of the shooting at Dealey Plaza. Went to Parkland. Mary Rice Brogan was with me. She was another Chronicle reporter. We grabbed a phone. We held that phone continuously until we got the statement from the doctor that the president was dead. I went outside. I saw Ralph Yarborough leaving. I said, where are you going? He said, we're going to Love Field to see Lyndon Johnson sworn in. He was going with Earl Cabell and several other politicians. I said, can I go with you? He said, well, if you can get in the station wagon in the back. So I crouched down behind the back seat, and we drove to Love Field. They gave us clearance to cross the field instead of going around. We got over there. Of course, I could not get on the plane. I was standing on the tarmac. I saw Judge Hughes come off the plane. I ran over and I said, Judge Hughes, did you swear in Lyndon? And she said, yes, Bo, I did. I turned around, wondering where I could get to a phone. At that moment, Southwest Bell Telephone's truck stopped, unloaded a portable telephone on the tarmac. I stepped into it and reach out and touch someone. They did. I dialed our number. The operator came on and said, what number are you calling from? And I looked and I said, there's no number on this phone. She said, you can't call from a phone that has no number. I said, look, I'm with the Houston Chronicle. I'm trying to call my desk to tell them that LBJ has just been sworn in. She said, I'll put you through. And so we did, and I don't have the extra that had that, but since extras have been mentioned, this was a story that day with the poll story here about how the race would come out. This is I don't have the first extra for some reason. This is the second extra. We put out 2 that day. They had yanked the poll story luckily off the front page with the bulletin about Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Then we had on Sunday, and I'll cut the story right here, they talked about trying to get people to put out extras. When we were at Parkland, Connally had his first press conference that morning, and we had gone out there for that. As we left the press conference, I saw some reporters running down the hall. I said, what's happening? They said, Oswald's been shot and they're bringing him in here. I ran down to the doorway at the entrance where they were bringing him in on the stretcher. I looked down at him and I said to myself, he's dead. He was very gray. Mary Rice and I called the Chronicle, got a hold of someone there on Sunday afternoon. Well, I suppose it was still morning, but anyway, and said, look, Oswald's been shot. We've got to get out an extra. And said, oh, we can't, call everybody in and put out an extra Sunday afternoon. I said, look, here's a guy that is supposed to have assassinated the president. Now he's been assassinated. Let's put out an extra. I think they had to call the editor to get a decision on doing it, but they did. So we had two extras on the assassination of the president, an extra on Oswald. I was there for about 10 days. I went home. I still have nightmares occasionally where I see that car coming almost to a stop and then accelerating, and I wake up screaming.
I can understand. I can understand. This isn't, yes, it's working now. Our next speaker has no name card, but he has a lot to tell us. He's Tom Ollier, and that's what it takes. Tom was with WFAA TV at the time, and I don't know where all he was that day, but I know he was in the depository building shooting on almost every floor, and I know he was very many other places too. Tom, fill us in.
Well, a little background. First, the grunts in the TV business have to provide along the way. But anyway, I got the lead-off position from assignment editor Berg, who coordinated the thing. And that was to meet the president in Fort Worth. You don't meet the president, really. But he was 4 hours late. After midnight, he pulled up in front of the Texas hotel. The Secret Service people had all the news photographers, cameramen, and photographers. I'd like to bring that up right now. When you read about a camera or a photographer, a cameraman is a movie camera, a photographer is a still, if that'll help you. All right. The president comes in, when he gets out of the limousine, instead of walking into the hotel, he walks across the street. There's people over there. Our barricades came down. Every newsman said all the rules are gone. We follow the president. The Secret Service started bumping into one another, grabbing at us, running up to the side of the president, trying to get ahead of him, trying to discourage him from going into the crowd across the street. He went in. We filmed this. He said a few words and he went in. That was Thursday night. That night, a couple of us went to the press club. I was taking some shots inside. Might be a special feature, and if so, I'll need some expansion footage. There were about 2 or 3 fellows there that were sitting at a table. The reason I mention this is because of this FBI business and Secret Service people in the press club drinking. There were these people, they were well behaved. I didn't know who they were. I shot them with the camera, you understand. And winding the camera, it broke. Here's a newsman covering the presidential visit with a broken camera. Quickly, I borrowed one from our stringer. The next day, I'll go through this. This is boring, but it helps in the background. The next morning, the same thing happened. When he comes down, instead of going to the breakfast, he goes over and meets the people across the way. And we all hustle on the Secret Service. They panic again, and he goes back, and we wait on the camera, and he flies to Dallas. We drive the news unit back to Dallas, and the fellow who was assisting me, Ray Johns, and I, we were coming in Commerce. We were parked on Commerce Street, inbound, on the way back to WFA with the film that I had shot of the president in Fort Worth. Of course, I covered his speech and everything inside. Our assignment was over. We were directly opposite where the president was hit. If I had turned my head to the left, I would have probably seen the whole thing. I did not see it. I did not hear any shots. I think the first thing I heard was when the 3 radios from the news unit were blasting, and an excited voice yelled through one of the radios. The shots had been fired at the president, not these exact words. All units around the presidential motorcade, I suppose. Code 3, Parkland Hospital.
Excuse me just 1 second. Is this mic working at all?
My mic is not working?
No, mine is not working, but could you tell us how you got in the depository? I think that's so important, what you saw in there and how you got in there and how fast you got in there.
I just arrived at that.
Well, for the sake of time, let's arrive.
Okay. All right, I'll speed on. So I heard this. I looked at them in Houston. I grabbed my partner's camera. Mine was broken, 3 rolls of film. That gave me 500 rolls of film, and we got to hurry. I can't explain the other 2 right now. I raced across. I see the people rushing around and running for cover. I film on the way as I cross Main Street and toward Elm Street. And people are diving. People are jumping on top of kids. I think they're hit. I start filming them. And I'm looking for policemen. They're not around. One's running this way, one's running this way. Some people are running toward the railroad tracks, some are running toward the monument area. Is that fast enough?
You're doing well.
I better hurry up. I'll leave out a whole bunch of stuff and we'll just get right. All right. So I thought there's nothing going on here. I remembered the Elman Houston bet. Okay, I'll go to Elman Houston. I go up there and there's a crowd of people there, a couple of cops, one car. There's no action here. So I said, the police have to be someplace. Usually when somebody shoots the President of the United States, there's some kind of activity there. Or where he was, there was none. All right, one guy was looking up, I look up, following his gaze. I said, this to myself, this is why there are no policemen, they're all in the building. I rushed to the building. I hit the door of the building at the same time, 15, I don't know, Kent Biffle can probably give you a better idea because Biffle was crawling up my back as we went through the door. And I heard a fellow say, shut the door, lock it, nobody in and out. I'm waiting to see if he heard the same thing, because I'm sure that he'll be talked to. So Biffle and I were the only two newsmen in. Biffle had his pencil and I had my camera. I followed the people up the search team and up the elevators, 4th floor, 5th floor. We go around the 5th floor, all guns were out. Big burly guy, well, not a big burly guy. One fella comes up and says, what are you doing here? Well, I'm with the press. No, we don't want the press on, just get down. I turned and walked toward the stairway with the camera down. And go around a couple of boxes and fall in behind. And this, I found out later, he was some kind of a federal man. Now, whether he was Secret Service, I won't go into that, sorry. God, I didn't think I had to run through this fast. All right, on the 5th floor, I'm going to get questions on this. I was walking with this officer, plainclothesman, and we see a sack on the floor and a Dr. Pepper bottle. I said, 5th floor. He hit it with his toe. Some chicken bones came out of it. Oh, I'm not going fast enough. Some chicken bones came out of it, and I was interested because it was the first thing so far I'd had to shoot. So I got some close-up shots of the sack, the bottle, and the chicken bones. And he walked on, because at that time they were not interested in 3-day-old dried chicken bones. And because they were looking for somebody that was going to be shooting back at them any second, they thought, we all thought. I run to the window and I walked to the window, it was open, and I shoot down and got pictures of the newsmen that were locked out, waiting to get in, the police officers who were arresting people and carting them off, and then joined the team again. There was nothing but the chicken bones, dried chicken bones on the 5th floor. Then we went up to the 6th floor. And get up there about, I don't know, maybe a minute and a half, something like that. The fellow said, Captain Fritz. And everybody said, come here. We walked over there. The fellow had found, you know his name, I won't go into it. He'd found the barricade and the window, open window with the boxes in the window. And I filmed the barricade and I filmed the boxes in the window the way they were before anybody touched them. And the boxes were placed in a particular, very interesting way that alters a lot of people's concept, because these were the only pictures that were ever recorded of the way the boxes were actually placed in the window. Because before our friends downstairs with the still cameras and other cameras were allowed into the building. Shall I stop?
I was going to ask you if you saw the gun. Did you actually see the rifle and shoot it?
That's more interesting, I guess, than the boxes, though, isn't it?
A little bit.
Yeah. Anyway, they tore up the arrangement and dusting for fingerprints and stacked them on top of one another. So the pictures you see of the barricade and all this, the barricade was torn down. From the barricade, you could not see the window. But we'll go through that. All right. And we went to we secured that floor, went to the 7th floor. Nothing there. We went to the roof. And for those who are going to ask a question, no, there was no rifle on the roof. There was no rifle on the roof. We looked everywhere. We came back down to the 7th floor. We researched the 7th floor. We came back to we were retracing our steps. This was
Tom,
Mr. Grumpy.
Forgive me, I'm going to have to stop you because we're going to have to leave some room for some questions. You brought up some things that probably people will want to ask questions, so let's have some time for those.
All right, I'll just stop and maybe we'll talk about finding the rifle later. Huh?
All right.
Yeah,
well, we'll have some questions.
Yeah, all right, that's a good idea.
All right, our next speaker on the panel was a reporter for the Dallas Morning News who I think was probably with 3 other reporters the closest press people to the president when he was shot. Mary Woodward was her name then. It's Mary Woodward Pillsworth now, and she comes from a suburb or very close to Albany, New York. And I remember Mary's story, what she came back and wrote that day. She came back, incidentally, and said the president's dead, and a lot of people didn't take her serious because she was excited, as we all were. Well, I'll let you tell it, Mary.
Well, first of all, I'm very happy to be here as a representative of my gender. You may notice on your list of participants that I'm an addendum, and that's rather descriptive of my role on that day as well. We were going to stop right in Dealey Plaza on Houston Street, but it was a little crowded there, and the crowds were thin over on Elm Street, so we walked across to Elm and stationed ourselves just down from the school book depository building and waited for the parade to come by. And we were chatting, and as we were talking, I looked up at the grassy knoll. And I said to my friends, I said, that's a very dangerous looking spot to me. It must be a lot of security up there because it looks like a perfect spot if somebody wanted to do something. And then the motorcade came along, and I couldn't believe it. Finally, I'm going to see Jacqueline Kennedy, and she's looking in the other direction. So I yelled, and I said, please look this way. And they looked right at us, waved, and at that moment, I heard a very loud noise, and I wasn't sure what it was at that point. And I turned to my friends and asked, what was that? Is some jerk shooting off firecrackers? And then I heard the second one, and this time I knew what had happened because I saw the president's motion. And then the third shot came very, very quickly on top of the second one. And that time I saw his head blow open, and I very well knew what had happened by that point. But what I couldn't really believe, as someone else mentioned, was the car had, after that first shot, had come practically to a stop. And later on, in looking back on, I said I could not believe how well-trained Secret Service people reacted so slowly. I would have expected that from ordinary human beings, but I expected that they would have reacted much quicker, because I've always felt in my mind that I knew the first shot missed. I had never wavered on that, and I see now that it's getting a lot of support. But I said that from day one, that the first shot missed. I've never changed my mind on that. I felt the second shot was not a mortal blow, so I felt that had there been proper reaction time, that the man might still be alive today. But immediately after that, we waited just for a few minutes on the street corner, kind of gathering ourselves, and we walked back to the Dallas Morning News. And when we walked in, and I met my supervisors, and I kept saying, the president's been killed, the president's been killed. And nobody really wanted to believe me, and my friends who were with me would not even support me in that. They were saying, well, something happened, he's been shot, there's been shooting, but nobody was willing to say they've killed him. But I kept insisting, he's dead. I know he's dead, or else I hope he's dead, because his head's blown open. Eventually, they started to take me a little seriously. I guess some other reports were coming in, and they said, well, please write it down. Sit down and write it down. So I started writing the story, and I wrote it exactly as I knew it from that moment, without having talked to anyone else, without being influenced by any outside people. I wrote it as I saw it. And to this day, I think I wrote it correctly. I read it again for the first time just in preparation for coming here, and I said in that story that there were 3 shots. I said that there was a pause between the first and the second one. I said the first shot did not hit anything, and I believe that very strongly to this day. The only thing that I guess I got myself in a little bit of controversy about, I said that the shots appeared to have come from behind me and to my right. And I did say seemed to. I didn't say they did come from that direction. Because first of all, I have very great difficulty discerning the direction of sounds anyway. I'm the kind of person on the thruway, when I hear a siren, I panic because I don't know where it's coming from. And secondly, I had spoken to my friends just prior to the event, suggesting that the grassy knoll would be the perfect spot for an assassin. So I said it was somewhat like self-fulfilling prophecy, that when it happened, I naturally expected to have come from where I had predicted it would come from. So in reality, I do believe they did come to the school book depository building, so I get a little bit upset when I get put in the other column. But it made me very interesting to a number of people, including people like Mark Lane and Jim Garrison, who repeatedly tried to contact me and raise the question of why I was not called before the Warren Commission, and the reason why, of course, was because I had said the shots had come from the other direction. But in reality, I never spoke to either of the gentlemen, although they both have indicated, including Mark Lane in the Warren Commission, that he had spoken to me. But I never spoke to Mark Lane in my life, except to say I wouldn't speak to him.
Sometimes that's enough.
I guess so. We learn hard, don't we? But just a little concluding thing. At the end of that day, I went home at my regular time, but we were all so keyed up that I decided I had to go back to the office. So I went back that evening, and as a journalist perspective, it was just amazing. It was like when I was growing up and wanting to be a journalist, it's what I thought journalism was going to be like, with this city room of people yelling "copy boy" and running back and forth and bells going off. And that's just like it was that night. And there were people from all over the world there, and I stayed on all night long. I spoke Spanish, so I was translating for people, and I was running copy. And from that, it was another very interesting and exciting aspect of being a journalist on that night. And I don't know if we'll ever see something like that again, but it was truly like some movies. I felt I was back in front page.
Thank you, Mary. I hope we'll never see anything like that again. Our next panelist, Bill Winfrey, who was at that time a Dallas Morning News photographer. Bill was all over this story. He was all over it. I don't know where he was that day. I know I ran into him, and I ran into him and went with him on other days. But Bill, tell us your story.
Well, first of all, I was assigned to cover the luncheon. I was given this set of credentials, the invitation from the Dallas Citizens Council, the Dallas Assembly, and the Science Research Center. I think we forgot who put on the luncheon. Request the pleasure of the company of Mr. Bill Winfrey at a luncheon in honor of the President and Mrs. Kennedy, the Governor and Mrs. Connolly.
Bill, you can't read all those names. I'm sorry, but
but anyhow, without this, you didn't go near this. All of the photographers and reporters were given these credentials, and everyone I've talked to is told there's a way. These hanging tags, Jerry's got here, is okay. This press tag, you had to have pinned on you to get around and do this. I went to the Trade Mart, set up my cameras, waiting for the President to get there, and walked down and talked to the Deputy Chief Lumpkin, who was in charge of security there. When they came by, they went by at a high rate of speed, and you could see people hovering in the back seat, and the Secret Service hanging around, and the motorcycles. They went right on by. We then found out that from Deputy Chief Lumpkin that he had been hit twice. We did not know, with rocks, bottles, guns, whatever. I went inside and found Tom Simmons, Joe Daly, the president of the Dallas Morning News at that time, John King, Bill Reeves, the people I worked for, and told them what had happened, asked to be relieved of my duty. I had an assignment. We followed blindly. I picked up Tom Milligan, the farm editor. And this is a good point in case for journalism. The farm editor came with me to help. Carried my camera bags, an extra camera, and helped shield me. I'm going to take a little bit of time here because this is important. When we got to Parkland Hospital, I had to park way around, but I knew where emergency was. I'd been there before. As I ran around the building, all you photographers will appreciate this, I had a 400 millimeter lens with a new gadget called a follow focus. You squeeze it to focus the camera. It looked like a bazooka or a Uzi. The Secret Service immediately run up and put guns to me and Tom's head, made us lie on the ground and looked at my camera. So we could have been killed out there too. But we went around and I made pictures of Jackie when she walked out of the hospital, Mrs. Cabell sitting alone in the car, the Roses laying in a pool of blood in the thing, and then they came out and said we're going to have and all of the hundreds of people that were kneeling and praying around the hospital. Malcolm held a press conference right after that, and he said the president is dead. By then, we had Washington, Austin, Mike Quinn, Bob Baskin, all these people in the press corps that came in. I took all of these people in my car back to the Dallas News. Tom Dillard was on foot. He'd been riding in the presidential motorcade, so they all piled into my car, about 7 of us, I think. I had two-way radios. As we started back to the Dallas News, instant footnote, we had to stop. Bob Baskin was a basket case. He came apart. We stopped, and Tom Milligan bought him a bottle of whiskey. We never told Bill Reeves that. I believe the man, he hyperventilated, the man would have died. We saved his life. What can I say? Anyhow. Yeah. But as we got a few blocks from the news on my police radio, again, we came right through Dealey Plaza on the far side, coming east. They said the policeman had been shot in Oak Cliff, and they thought, somebody on the radio, as I remember, told us that they thought there was a connection between the assailant. I dropped off Dillard to go take charge of photographers, Baskin and Quinn and all of them. They'll remember some of that. Bob's dead now, but I'm sure Mike said this morning, and Milligan. But I went over there, and as I got a half a block from the Texas Theater, here come the police in a throng, pushing somebody out the door and putting them in a car. I turned and crossed over the median strip, turned around and beat the police to the police station, parked my car, second lane out from the curb. They impounded it. The Dallas News did not pay for that. But I rushed upstairs where I was able to make this picture when Oswald came off the elevator. And Bert particularly likes this picture here. I have him in the elevator. I know, but just right through there. And then I made this one as they went down through here. This one I made later on of Ruby, and this one during the trial I made of Marguerite. I took her out of the corridor, and we went and had lunch, and we went over, and I posed this one there. Photographers always scheming about something.
Bill, pardon me.
Yes.
We're going to have to move on. We're running a little bit late.
Well, that's about it. I stayed there all evening. That night, Jack Ruby was in the hallway. I don't know. I can't remember why Hugh Ainsworth and I knew him, and everybody at all these strip clubs up and down through there, but we knew them all.
We're going to move on right now.
In talking to him, as I remember, Jack Ruby was the one that broached the idea of sending out for food. I do know that Pete Lucas of Lucas B&B brought 2 big trays of food, the sandwiches and the ham and the turkeys and stuff up there that we ate. Jack was like all of us. We were dumbfounded. And
I'm going to get the hook now, Bill. Thanks very much. But
okay.
we do have to move. We've got several people to hear from. Our next panelist, Jim Featherston, was a courthouse reporter for the Times-Herald that day. Jim was all over the place. He interviewed people at the scene, the witnesses that day, and including a couple of controversial situations. Would you tell us, Jim? He's now in Baton Rouge, teaches at LSU.
That day, I was at the corner of Main and Houston Street, and
that was shortly before the president was killed. There's a picture made, by the way, of me, and it's in the background. And the Associated Press said this was made a minute before the president was assassinated. I heard the shots, but honestly, I didn't recognize them as gunshots. I thought they were firecrackers, and so I wasn't counting. If somebody asked me today how many shots I heard, I would say at least 3. At any rate, I ran down on Dealey Plaza and I talked to 2 women, Mary Mormon, who had taken a Polaroid picture, and Jean Hill. I got there. I wanted that picture, period. At that time, I thought there was only such a picture in existence. So Mary Mormon agreed to give me the film. I asked both of them to come back to the press room with me, which they did. I interviewed them. I called the rewrite desk. I really don't know who was on the rewrite desk, but they gave, in their own words, they said what they had seen. And what they had seen was the president shot about 10 feet in front of them. I'm going to dwell on this just a minute because later on Jean Hill told the Warren Commission. I went down there and I grabbed Mary Mormon. She was crying. I wouldn't let her go. Then I took them to a strange room. Of course, that was the courthouse press room.
Pretty strange. Pretty strange.
Well, it was a pretty strange room. But by the way, there's about a half a dozen of us as a graduate. John Shukoff,
what's his name?
Bob Welch, and Jimmy Darnell, and Darwin Payne.
Jim Laird.
Well, yeah, but Jim Laird's not here today. I'm talking about the people that are here today. Well, at any rate, she also said I told them they couldn't leave, and told them what I had to, wouldn't let them say, and so forth. This is all Don said. But that was about the extent of my activities that day. We had an old bottle of Thunderbird wine in the press room, and some lawyer gave it to us as a joke. He didn't think we were low enough to drink Thunderbird wine. but I drank every bit of it that day. Something else I'd like to talk about along that line involves several people here. Charlie Diamond for one, and Darwin Payne for the other. The first time I met Darwin Payne was when the prisoners escaped during the trial, during the trial. And I called the Times Herald and told them that 5 or 6 prisoners had escaped. And I'm sure Charlie thought I was drunk, so he sent Darwin down to check up on me. Of course, I interviewed Marguerite Oswald, and I tried to interview Robert Oswald, a brother. He wouldn't talk to me. And I covered a lot of the Ruby trial. There's something else I want to say, and I can't think of what it was at the moment, but...
Well, if you think about it, we'll come back to you.
Well, let me say one thing about all these conspiracy theories. I think that Hugh Ainsworth knows more about the assassination than anybody, and I think Walter Cronkite said that. Did Walter Cronkite say that one time?
Oh, he said a lot of things.
Yeah. But let me say one more thing. Like a lot of people, I'm not completely satisfied with the Warren report, but we were never able to come up with anything better, and I don't think we ever will. That's all I got to say.
Thank you, Jim. Our next panelist is Kent Biffle, who was then a reporter for the Dallas News, now is a columnist for the Dallas News. In between, he worked with me for a while at Newsweek. Kent was in a motorcade that day, and I know you were in the school book depository building. Tell us a little bit about that, if you will, Kent.
Well, I was going to, I feel like a kind of a truth squad following up Tom Allier. Now, actually, he set the scene pretty well there in the school book depository building. We went in with the first wave of policemen, really, and they immediately sealed off the building, and so we had it all to ourselves. for the first, I don't know, 2 or 3 hours after the assassination, we got really tired of looking at each other. But we were, there were some things going on. Of course, the crime lab people were investigating, and I remember I was worried when we first went in. I was afraid that a policeman was going to shoot me because these guys all had their guns out and they were nervous. And I remember once stepping out of an office where I'd interviewed some office workers on the second floor, and there was a policeman at one end of the hall and another at the other end of the hall, and they both had riot guns, and they both threw down on me when I stepped out in the hall. But I never worried much about the assassin, because I kind of had a theory that with the last shot he had killed himself, and that they'd find the body there in the building somewhere. But and in fact, when one of the detectives yelled at Captain Fritz, over here. Well, I thought, well, they finally found his body, but it was the rifle that the detective had found. You could see part of the muzzle and part of the butt plate sticking from under a box of books there. And then a little later, an officer came in and told Captain Fritz, we've got a man down in Oak Cliff. And they didn't immediately link this up with the assassination. It was like an altogether isolated incident. I recall that they reacted to this. They said his name is Tippett, and at first, you know, they were all cast down because there was apparently an extroverted policeman named Tippett that they all knew and liked, and they were kind of relieved to hear it was not him but the other Tippett who had been killed. Apparently, J.D. was a quiet sort of man, and he was not well known to these detectives. But then a little later, Roy Truly, the manager of the school building, came in and announced that one of his workers had not reported back after lunch, and his name was Lee Oswald. And so things kind of dragged along, and after a while I decided I'd better get back to the office and write a story. By then, I was told I could leave the building, but I couldn't get back in. So Tom and I kind of enjoyed the exclusive story about as long as we could, and then, but I had to get back to the office to write. And I began walking back to the Dallas Morning News, and that name began to sound familiar, Lee Oswald. And then I remembered 3 or 4 years earlier, I'd been working at the Fort Worth Press, the old Fort Worth Press, and had written several stories about this Marine who had defected to Russia. I'd interviewed his brother and interviewed his mother. His name was Lee Harvey Oswald. And I snapped, you know. But by the time I got back to the office, Lee Oswald had been identified by the wire stories and everywhere, and so there was that exclusive didn't last very long. And anyhow, after that, the days all kind of just ran together. I still have difficulty sorting them out because it was one of those, as newsmen, you've all been on stories like this where you roll out of bed in the morning, put on your shoes, and they're still warm.
Thank you, Kent. Thanks very much. Now, another gentleman without a name tag, but that doesn't mean he isn't important. His name is Bob Welch, and he's been a do-everything for WBAP, TV, radio, many years. How many years, Bob?
Since 1960.
Since 1960. Everywhere I went during the assassination, I'd either see he or Jimmy Darnell. They were everywhere. Tell us a little bit about it, Bob.
Well, Jimmy and I were actually at Love Field starting our day for Kennedy's arrival
And we were there when he arrived, and Jackie, as she said, it was beautiful. And the president was handsome and young and red-headed, and he had a green and white striped shirt and looked like a yuppie more than a president. Of course, we didn't know him as yuppies then, but I was very, very impressed with this Democratic president, and was very pleased to be there recording this event. And I filmed his going up and down the line of people shaking hands with everybody. Everybody's very cordial, very supportive of the president. And he was very receptive to it all. And, he got in his car with Jackie and the entourage, Governor Connolly and Nellie Connolly. I was right there on the periphery of the car shooting that, about as close as you can get to a president without getting whisked away. And I was very pleased to have that position. A lot of the film that's on the air these days, that's the film that you see. And other photographers there, but we all think that was the film, was our film. And some of it was. And he drove off, and I was elated to succeed it there at the airport. But my job was then to go to the trademark. Jimmy, in turn, was getting in the car to follow the president. There's only two. As Eddie Barker earlier had said, there's 34 people or whatever at KRLD. And we may have had that number at WBAP, which is now KXAS. But for all practical purposes, for WBAP, there were four warm bodies. There was Jimmy Kerr, who's no longer with us, who's wonderful, and was our bureau chief, and gave us the leadership there. There was Jimmy, and there's Dan Owens. Is Dan here? Is he here? Oh, thank you. I'm so glad he's here. He was one of the four, and there's only four of us, and myself. So there's really four people covering the biggest story. I mean, that's why we're all here today, which I think is rather interesting. Later on, as the story moved on, of course, more people became involved. But for all practical purposes, there's four of us in the game plan here in Dallas, and Dan Owens certainly was one of them. And so anyway, I went to the Trade Mart after the arrival, and everything was fine. I was excited. I had my position. I was supposed to, excuse me, I was supposed to film his arrival at the Trade Mart. I'm standing next to a squadron of motorcycles, long line of motorcycles, outside the main entrance of the Trade Mart. From out of nowhere comes, in a very loud, as it was related to earlier, message that there's been a shooting in the motorcade. Horrible message for a young man. I was 27 at the time. And listening to this and in disbelief, but about the same time that I'm hearing this and trying to grasp what's happening, standing next to these motorcycles, I'm hearing these sirens coming down Stemmons and then turning on to Harry Hines Boulevard in front of the Trade Mart. I see it, and as I see it, I react to it. I run toward a news car, which is maybe 150 feet from where I am. I'm credentialed, and I was able to be there, parked. And as the car was passing and I was watching the car, I could see Jackie hunched over the president. I couldn't see the president, but I could see Jackie in her pink outfit bending over. So I knew he was hurt. I didn't see the assassination because I was at the Trade Mart. Jimmy was in the motorcade, he shot that business. But I knew we had a problem. I got into the news car, and instinctively I pulled out of the parking lot of the Trade Mart. Parkland was about a mile or two from where we were. And I pulled in behind the president's limousine, if you can believe that, but I did, out of pure ignorance more than anything else. I didn't know. I just knew I had to get to where the problem was going. And I later learned in the Warren report, although I never saw it, I've heard from some sources, that one of the FBI fellows in the motorcade there asked or was concerned about this car. They couldn't see the WBAP TV because it wasn't in the front, it was on the side. So they were looking back at me, and they were concerned about this car that was much too close to Kennedy's car, to the limousine, and the bank of officers. And the message was, should we rub them out?
Bob, I hate to interrupt, but do you have a final thought or two? We're going to have to move. We're already late.
Oh, okay. Well, that's fine.
Thank you very much. I have two other people I want to call from the audience just for brief remarks. One is Vivian Castleberry. She was the woman's editor, I think, or at least was the woman reporter at the Times Herald at the time. She pressed all the barriers and all the limits and has done so many things I could hardly describe her. But Vivian has a couple of stories she wants to tell. Vivian?
Well, number one, I want to say that everybody who had anything to do with covering the story at one time or another thought they had an exclusive. And so it is nothing unusual for all of you up here to think you had an exclusive. Second thing that I want to do is to say that I was at the Trade Mart that day. I was interviewing people as they came into the luncheon. I interviewed Judge Sarah Hughes when she came in, and I recall vividly, all of you who ever interviewed Sarah Hughes know what a master of understatement she was. So when she got there that day and I interviewed her, I recall vividly that she said three things. One, that it was a great day for Dallas. Second, that she had been gravely concerned about the president visiting Dallas. And third, that she would be glad when he left Dallas. So I wrote those things down in my reporter's notebook, scribbling on an envelope, as most of the others of you did. And then I called her that afternoon at her home right after she had sworn the president in, and she gave me one of the first interviews that she gave. And again, she was a master of understatement. It was no big deal, you know. He was my friend. They called and asked me to come, and I went. The second thing that I would like to do is to corroborate in detail everything that Mary said to you. Because when I got back finally at 3 o'clock that afternoon to the paper, it was bedlam and it was organized chaos at the Times Herald. But about between 3 and 4 o'clock, I had a telephone call from a first cousin. And her first words to me were, "Today I saw the president die." And I said, "Peggy, don't say another word until I put a piece of paper in my typewriter." And she quoted to me almost in exact detail what Mary has already told you. The interesting thing was that Peggy Burney was Abe Zapruder's direct assistant. And so far as I know, her name appeared in a lot of the follow-up, but so far as I know, she was never interviewed by the Warren Commission. She was standing next to him when he took the famous film and was holding some of his camera equipment even while he did it. So I thought that was a fascinating detail that maybe you'd be interested in.
Thank you, Vivian. James Ike Altgens, well-known photographer for the AP, shot a very memorable picture that day, among others, I'm sure, but it became very controversial because, as I recall, and I do recall, it showed a man that looked like Oswald in the door of the depository building, a fellow named Billy Lovelady, I believe. Ike, could you tell us a bit more about that?
The Associated Press has a rule. The rule is if you're going to write a story, make it short. And I've got 5 hours of copy I could give you, but I'm going to try to condense it to just about 3 minutes. I'm going to omit some things that you have read. I have already testified to the Warren Commission, so chances are you've picked that up there. But there is an essential part to this entire sequence of events that I have a personal touch with that I think that you will find to be very interesting. I had already made a snapshot up at the corner of Main and Houston, and I came on down to position myself in an area where I could make something of a little bit better picture close up. I had already also made a picture at the time, the first shot that I heard. I made a picture, you probably have seen it, where John Kennedy is grabbing his throat. Then I had positioned myself in a way that I had already pre-focused to the middle of the street from where I stood at the curb level, 15 feet That was on the scale, so I'm not exaggerating. That's the way it showed on my camera. As the progression of the unit came down and it got very close to me and I was prepared to make the picture, I never took it. I don't know if you've ever been pressured. I don't know if you've ever been startled. I don't know if you've ever been shocked to a point that you just sort of get glassy-eyed. But this man, his head, when it exploded, sent a signal to everybody there was a gun being fired from some source. And when the fragments came over, and some of it falling at my feet, it was for very, very real. I did recover enough in time to make a picture of the Secret Service man going up to over the deck lid in order to bring Jackie Kennedy back inside the car. I had a call from a woman. She says, what is your remembrance about Jackie Kennedy being on the back of that limousine? I said, the woman was scared out of her mind, and she was looking for a way to escape. Well, that's not the way I heard it. I thought she just went out there for some fresh air. And I think you can recognize that under conditions like this, you're not going for a stroll, even if it is crawling around on the deck lid of an automobile. Now, pay attention to this, because this is very important. I've had these so many people coming to me about crossfire from the knoll and from the other areas. When John Kennedy was hit by this bullet that obliterated the back of his head, and it did come from the rear, there was no question about it because of the movement of the body, and I didn't realize at the time he was wearing a back brace that held him in position, and he was already tilted from the earlier shot toward his wife. So when he got the blast from the rear, that released his being caught into that cushion, and he continued to fall in that position, right into Jackie Kennedy's lap. But here is what's important. As John Kennedy was falling down into Jackie Kennedy's lap, there was no blood on the right-hand side of his face. There was no blood on the front of his face, but there was a tremendous amount of blood on the left-hand side and at the back of the head, which suggests to me if someone was shooting from any other position, there would be evidence in that particular area because they didn't find any body blows from bullets and shrapnel that could have been somewhere else. It could have come from that direction. It's all a hypothesis. It has not yet been proven by anyone, but it sounds good if you're a conspirator to the point that you believe in conspiracies and that sort of thing. Well, now, after this had taken place, you know, there was a large group of people that were running up to this area, later called the Grassy Knoll. Some were uniformed and some were not. Some had rifles, some had pistols, and I was on the opposite side of the street. So I got over on the other side, thinking perhaps that they had run the assassin up into that corner. I knew it had to be coming from the rear, so I figured they had scouted him out, and the guy was on the run, and so across the street to try to get a picture of the assassin right along with the rest of the people, but my gosh, they all turned around and started coming back down. It's just one of those episodes that you find when people scatter in all directions trying to find the assassin. I left the area, and I was joined by Jerry Haynes. As I was running back to the office, Jerry ran with me. We got green lights at every intersection, and he was getting back to the station because he was going to help Julie Bonnell with her program, and he would have some information to pass on to her at that time as well. I went on into the Dallas News Building. The elevator was waiting, and I went on up to the office, and I picked up the inter-office telephone. Bob Johnson, our bureau chief, was answering the phone, and I told him the president had been shot. How do you know this? And I said I was taking pictures at the time, and I said Mrs. Kennedy at the time when it occurred, she yelled out, "Oh no," and then she got up and started running around crawling around on the back part of the deck lid of the vehicle. This turned out to be the first eyewitness report that was circulated on our wire service. I understand we beat UPI by a minute or two, but this is something that is unavoidable when you've got two men in an automobile, one UPI, one AP, and they're fighting over the telephone and pull it right out of the connection.
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to stop you. They're getting the hook, and I'm going to be pulled off of here in a minute. Thank you so very much, and thanks to our panel. I'm sorry we're run over a little bit.
I want to give you one.
This is where we have a brief break programmed in, so let's take about a 10-minute break, and then we'll resume after that.
It's great, Jerry.
This conference was hosted by Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas. These panels will re-air this morning on C-SPAN, beginning at 4:40 a.m. Eastern Time. Coming up next, the Republican Governors Association holds a meeting in Phoenix, Arizona.